At first, it sounded like everything was working exactly as it should. The distant thud of artillery rolled across the landscape in slow, deliberate intervals, echoing through the broken countryside with a rhythm the men had come to understand. It was not comforting in any ordinary sense, but it was familiar, and in war familiarity often passed for safety. The guns behind them were active, responsive, alive in a way that suggested order still existed somewhere beyond the smoke and mud. Each outgoing shell carried with it a quiet assurance that someone, somewhere, still had a clear picture of the battlefield. The unit had taken up position along a shallow defensive line that curved with the natural contours of the land. Weeks of fighting had reduced the area to a patchwork of craters, splintered trees, and churned earth, but the terrain itself was no longer unknown. Men had walked it, crawled through it, memorized its dips and rises in the half-light before dawn. What cover remained had been reinforced with sandbags and scavenged timber, forming a defensive posture that felt, if not strong, at least deliberate. There had been German activity in the days prior, but it never developed into a full assault. Small patrols tested the line, probing for weaknesses before pulling back into the tree line. Occasionally, machine gun fire would crack across the fields, followed by silence that stretched long enough to unsettle even the most seasoned among them. These moments of tension had become routine, absorbed into the daily rhythm of waiting, watching, and trying not to think too far ahead. Now, as the artillery continued its steady work, the men began to adjust. Helmets were loosened. Shoulders dropped slightly from the rigid tension that had defined the previous nights. Some spoke in low voices. Their words carried just a few feet before dissolving into the damp air. Others busied themselves with small, repetitive tasks, cleaning weapons, checking ammunition, reinforcing already reinforced positions. These actions were less about necessity and more about control, a way to impose order on a situation that rarely offered any. The weather added to the strange sense of stillness. A low gray sky hung over the battlefield, heavy but undecided, threatening rain without committing to it. The air was cool, damp enough to cling to uniforms and seep into gloves. It carried the layered smells of earth, oil, and something faintly metallic that no one needed to identify aloud. Visibility stretched just far enough to reveal the skeletal remains of trees and the vague outlines of distant terrain, but not far enough to invite certainty. From time to time, the artillery fire intensified, the reports coming closer together, sharper, more urgent. Each increase drew brief attention, heads lifting instinctively, eyes narrowing as if distance could be measured by sound alone. But the pattern always settled back into its earlier rhythm, and with it came a quiet reassurance. This was controlled fire, calculated and directed. It meant that communication lines were open, that coordinates were being relayed, that the invisible structure connecting front and rear still held. For the officers, this belief was essential. They moved along the line with measured confidence, checking positions, offering brief instructions, maintaining the appearance of control that their men relied upon. Maps were consulted, though they had been revised so many times that no single version could be trusted completely. Still, they served their purpose, anchoring decisions to something tangible, something that could be pointed to and explained. Among the enlisted men, the understanding was simpler. The guns behind them were theirs. As long as those guns fired in a way that made sense, the situation, however dangerous, remained within the boundaries of expectation. Danger was acceptable when it followed rules. It was the unpredictable, the unexplainable, that unsettled them most. A shell burst in the distance, sending a muted plume of dirt into the air. No one flinched. The sound arrived a moment later, dulled by space and habit. Another followed, then another, each impact reinforcing the same conclusion. The artillery was doing its job, keeping the enemy at a distance, shaping the battlefield in ways that could not always be seen but were deeply felt. Time passed in this measured way, marked less by minutes than by the repetition of sound and motion. Watches were checked, but they held little authority here. Instead, the men tracked the day through subtler cues, the shifting tone of light beneath the clouds, the gradual cooling of the air, the slow accumulation of fatigue in muscles that never fully relaxed. There was a kind of uneasy balance to it all. The enemy was present but not pressing. The line was exposed but holding. The artillery was active but controlled. Each element existed in tension with the others, creating a fragile equilibrium that could be mistaken for stability if one looked at it from the right angle. And so they allowed themselves to believe it, at least for a while. They interpreted the distant shelling as part of a system that still functioned, a predictable exchange of force that followed understood patterns. It did not eliminate fear, but it gave it boundaries, contained within something that could be anticipated. In the quiet moments between the distant impacts, when the air seemed to hold its breath, a few men even felt something close to relief. Not comfort, not safety, but a temporary easing of the constant pressure that had defined their experience for so long. It was enough to let thoughts wander briefly beyond the immediate, enough to imagine that the worst of the uncertainty had already passed. But beneath that surface, small inconsistencies began to form, subtle enough to be dismissed, easy enough to ignore in the presence of routine. The rhythm, while steady, was not perfect. The spacing between impacts shifted in ways that did not quite align with expectation. The direction of sound, carried strangely by the damp air, hinted at angles that did not fully match the mental map each man carried. No one spoke of it yet. There was no clear reason to. The system still appeared intact, and in war, appearances often held more weight than doubt. The guns were firing. The line was holding. The enemy was out there, somewhere beyond sight. For now, that was enough. At first, the difference was so slight that it could be explained away without much effort. A shell landed closer than expected. Its impact sharper, its sound arriving a fraction sooner than the men had grown used to. A few heads turned, more out of instinct than concern, and then settled again as the next report echoed farther out, restoring the pattern they trusted. No one spoke of it. In a landscape shaped by chaos, a single deviation meant very little. But the next irregularity did not wait long. Another detonation followed, this time distinctly nearer, close enough for the ground beneath their positions to tremble with a more immediate force. Loose dirt slid from the edges of their shallow fortifications. A few men shifted where they crouched, adjusting their footing, glancing outward across the broken terrain, as if distance could be measured by sight alone. Still, there was no visible impact point, only the lingering cloud of disturbed earth rising somewhere between their line and the unseen enemy. The assumption held, but less comfortably. Perhaps the guns had adjusted their range. Perhaps the enemy had moved closer without being seen. These were explanations that fit within the established logic of the battlefield, and so they were accepted, at least for the moment. The officers noticed it too, though their reactions were more restrained. One of them unfolded a map already creased from repeated use, tracing a line with a gloved finger as he recalculated positions that had likely shifted hours ago. Another listened intently between impacts, trying to distinguish direction and distance through sound alone, a skill honed over months but never fully reliable. Orders were not given yet. There was still too much uncertainty, and acting too quickly carried its own risks. Then another shell came in, closer again. This time, the reaction was immediate. Several men instinctively ducked lower, pressing themselves into the shallow cover they had prepared. The explosion threw a sharper shockwave across the line, accompanied by the unmistakable hiss of fragments cutting through the air before embedding themselves somewhere out of sight. The distance was no longer theoretical. It could be felt, measuring the vibration of the ground and the sudden tension that returned to every movement. A murmur began to move through the ranks, quiet but persistent. It was not panic, not yet, but the beginning of something less defined. Questions formed without being fully spoken. Were the shells falling short? Had the targeting shifted? Was the enemy close and reported, or had something gone wrong behind them? Communication lines, already strained by the conditions of front, became the immediate focus. A runner was sent back toward a command post that lay beyond a series of shallow ridges, his path uncertain but necessary. Field telephones were checked, wires traced and reconnected where possible, though many had already been compromised by earlier shelling. Each attempt to establish clarity only highlighted how fragile their connection to the rear truly was. Another impact followed, again within that same uncomfortable proximity. This time, there was no mistaking it. The shell had landed well short of where it should have been, its force tearing the ground that was dangerously close to their own forward elements. dirt and debris scattered across the line, pattering against helmets and equipment. One man cursed under his breath, more out of reflex than intent, as he brushed soil from his rifle. The pattern, once steady and reassuring, had begun to shift in a way that could no longer be ignored. The intervals between impacts grew less consistent. Some shells struck farther out, as expected, but others fell short without warning, creating a disjointed rhythm that unsettled even those who had learned to endure the worst of artillery fire. The officers gathered briefly, their conversation low and urgent. Coordinates were compared against memory and map, each reference point carrying a degree of uncertainty. Landmarks that had once been clear had been reduced to indistinct shapes. Distances measured days ago no longer held the same meaning after repeated bombardments had altered the terrain. Even the orientation of their own line had shifted slightly as positions were reinforced and adjusted. One possibility began to take shape, though no one voiced it immediately. If the shells were landing short, then either the calculations were off or the guns themselves had been repositioned incorrectly. Both scenarios pointed to a breakdown somewhere behind the front, in the chain of command that was supposed to ensure precision. It was not an easy conclusion to accept. Another shell landed, closer than any before. The impact came with a force that sent a ripple through the entire line. This time, there was no ambiguity in the reaction. Men pressed themselves as low as possible, instinct overriding discipline as they sought whatever cover they could find. The sound was immediate, the delay between flash and report nearly non-existent. For a brief moment, the distinction between distant artillery and immediate threat disappeared entirely. Silence followed, but it was no longer the same kind of silence. It carried weight now, filled with unspoken recognition. The system they had trusted was no longer behaving in a predictable way. Each man felt it, even if he could not fully articulate it. The boundaries that had once contained their fear had begun to dissolve. Attempts to re-establish communication grew more urgent. Another runner was prepared, this time with clearer instructions, though the clarity itself was built on incomplete information. Messages were written quickly, coordinates scrawled with an urgency that left little room for precision. The goal was no longer perfect accuracy, but immediate correction. Around them, the environment seemed to shift in response to their uncertainty. The low sky pressed closer, the air heavier, as if the landscape itself was closing in. Every distant sound was now scrutinized, every incoming shell analyzed in the brief moments before impact. Patterns were sought where none could be confirmed. Each man tried to impose order on a situation that was slipping beyond their control. The belief in coordination had not yet collapsed, but it was no longer secure. It wavered, strained by each irregular impact, and each failed attempt to confirm what was happening beyond their line of sight. Trust, once assumed, now required justification, and none was readily available. Still, they held their positions. There was nowhere else to go, no immediate alternative that offered greater safety. The line, however flawed its support had become, remained their only structure in an environment that was rapidly losing definition. And so they waited, caught between what they believed should be happening and what was increasingly difficult to deny. The change, when it came fully into view, did not arrive as a single realization, but as a series of impacts that erased whatever doubt remained. The next shell fell within their line, not just close, not just uncomfortably near, but among them, the explosion tore into the earth with force that felt immediate and intimate, sending a wave of dirt, splinters, and fragments across positions that had been prepared to face the enemy, not their own guns. For a brief moment, the distinction between front and rear collapsed into something meaningless. Men reacted without waiting for orders. They dropped lower, pressing into shallow cover that now felt dangerously insufficient. Helmets struck the ground, elbows dug into mud, bodies flattened instinctively as if proximity alone might offer protection. The sound was different here, sharper and more contained, the shock wave arriving with a force that left no space for interpretation. This was no longer a question of range. It was a direct threat. Another shell followed, landing just beyond the first, its detonation overlapping with the fading echo of the previous impact. The pattern had shifted entirely. What had once been a distant, measured rhythm had become erratic and immediate, a series of strikes that seemed to walk across their position without clear direction. Each explosion forced the men to reassess their surroundings, to identify where the next impact might fall, though there was no reliable way to predict it. Shouts rose briefly, not in panic but in sharp, urgent bursts as men called out warnings, checked on one another, and attempted to impose some level of coordination on chaos. Names were spoken, positions confirmed, injuries assessed in the seconds between impacts. There was no time for extended thought, only reaction layered upon reaction, each movement shaped by the last. The officers moved along what remained of the line, their earlier composure now strained by the reality unfolding around them. One crouched beside a damaged field telephone, adjusting connections that had already been severed more than once. The wire ran back along a path that was no longer intact, disappearing into a landscape that had been repeatedly torn apart. He spoke into the receiver anyway, voice controlled but urgent, relaying corrections that he could not be sure would reach their destination. Another attempted to signal using flares, selecting one that should have indicated a need to adjust fire. The flare rose into gray sky, its brief arc visible against a low cloud cover before fading into the same muted light that obscured everything else. Whether it was seen, understood, or ignored remained impossible to determine. The system it relied upon required more than visibility. It required alignment, timing, and a chain of interpretation that now felt increasingly fragile. The shelling did not pause to allow for these efforts. It continued, irregular but persistent, each impact reinforcing the same conclusion. Whatever coordination had once guided the artillery was no longer functioning as intended. The guns behind them were still firing, but the logic that directed them had broken down somewhere beyond reach. Men began to adjust their positions, not to face forward as they had been trained, but to minimize exposure from above and behind. Trenches that had been dug with a clear orientation now offered uneven protection, their angles no longer aligned with the direction of threat. Some shifted into deeper sections, pressing against the sides where the earth might absorb more of the blast. Others sought cover in craters formed by earlier impacts, choosing the known depth of a hole over the uncertain shelter of constructed defenses. The psychological shift was as immediate as the physical one. Trust, once an underlying assumption, began to dissolve under the weight of repeated misfires. The artillery that had provided reassurance now demanded the same caution as enemy fire. Each distant report was no longer a signal of support, but a warning that another impact could follow, closer than the last, without regard for position or intent. Attempt to communicate continued, but each effort revealed further breakdowns. A runner who had been sent earlier did not return, his path likely disrupted by the very fire they were trying to correct. Another was prepared, but hesitation marked the decision. Sending a man back through an active bombardment carried its own risks, and the value of the message depended entirely on whether it could be delivered in time to matter. The map, once a point of reference, lost much of its authority. Coordinates that had seemed precise now felt abstract, disconnected from the rapidly changing terrain. Landmarks had been erased or altered beyond recognition, and distances measured in calm moments no longer applied under constant bombardment. The officers continued to consult it, but more out of necessity than confidence, each glance reinforcing the limits of what it could provide. Another shell struck within the line, closer to the center this time. The explosion threw debris across a wider area, and for a moment the air filled with a dense mixture of soil and smoke that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Coughing followed, harsh and involuntary, as men tried to clear their lungs while remaining low. The taste of earth lingered, gritty and persistent, settling into mouths and throats in a way that could not be ignored. In these moments, time compressed. The intervals between impacts felt shorter, though whether they actually were became difficult to judge. Each second was measured by anticipation, by the brief pause before the next detonation, by the instinctive bracing that preceded it. The body adapted quickly, muscles tightening in preparation, senses narrowing a focus on sound and movement. And yet, even within this intensity, a form of adaptation took hold. Men began to read the pattern, not in a strategic sense, but in a way that allowed for survival. They learned to recognize the subtle differences in incoming fire, the faint cues that preceded impact. It was not precise, and it was not reliable, but it offered a marginal advantage, a fraction of a second that could be used to adjust position or brace for the shock. The idea that this was temporary persisted, though it grew more uncertain with each passing minute. Surely the error would be identified. Surely the guns would be corrected or silenced. The system, flawed as it now appeared, was not expected to fail indefinitely. This belief held, not because it was supported by evidence, but because the alternative was too difficult to accept. Still, the shelling continued. With each impact, the distance between expectation and reality widened. The structures that had defined their understanding of the battlefield, clear lines, coordinated support, reliable communication, were no longer functioning in a coherent way. What remained was a fragmented experience, shaped by immediate threats and limited information. In this environment, survival became the primary objective, overriding broader considerations of strategy or position. The men focused on what they could control, their own movements, their immediate surroundings, the actions of those beside them. Larger questions, why this was happening, how it would be resolved, faded into the background, replaced by the constant need to endure the next impact. The artillery did not distinguish between friend and enemy. It followed its own broken logic, delivering force without context or correction. And as it continued to fall among them, the line that had once felt defined and stable became something far less certain, shaped not by intention, but by the unpredictable consequences of a system no longer in control. The realization did not arrive all at once, nor was it spoken aloud in any formal way. It settled gradually across the line, carried in a way men no longer questioned the source of incoming fire, in the way they adjusted their bodies without hesitation at the sound of their own guns. What had begun as confusion had hardened into certainty. The shells falling among them were not the result of enemy movement or misread terrain. They were coming from behind, from batteries that continued to operate without awareness of the damage they were inflicting. There was a grim efficiency in how this understanding took hold. It did not require confirmation through communication, which by now had become unreliable to the point of near irrelevance. It was confirmed instead through repetition, through the consistency of error. Each incoming round reinforced the same conclusion, until doubt no longer served any purpose. The men adapted not because they fully understood the cause, but because the pattern had made itself undeniable. The bombardment continued for a time that felt longer than it could be measured. Minutes stretched under the strain of anticipation, each interval between impacts carrying the weight of expectation rather than relief. Some shells fell just beyond the line, others within it, and a few struck areas that had already been torn apart, deepening craters that offered both danger and shelter. The randomness of it all was perhaps the most difficult aspect to accept. There was no direction to orient against, no enemy position to fix upon. The threat existed everywhere within reach. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the intensity began to lessen. The intervals between impacts widened, allowing longer moments of stillness to settle across the damaged ground. The men did not immediately trust the change. They remained low, bodies tense, listening for the next incoming round that might break the fragile pause. When a shell did fall, it came farther out, its distance measurable again in a way that suggested something had shifted beyond their immediate perception. The guns, it seemed, were being corrected, or perhaps they had been ordered to cease. The reason did not reach them, and in many ways it no longer mattered. What mattered was the absence that followed. As the final distant report faded into the low sky, a silence spread across the line that felt heavier than the bombardment itself. It was not the quiet of safety, but of aftermath, a space in which the consequences could no longer be deferred. Men began to move cautiously, lifting themselves from the positions they had pressed into for what felt like an extended collapse of time. The landscape around them had changed in subtle but significant ways. Existing craters had deepened, new ones marked the ground in irregular patterns, and the fragile structures they had built were partially undone. Sandbags had shifted or burst, timber supports splintered, and the thin lines that had once defined their positions were now blurred. Attention turned quickly to the immediate human cost. Names were called again, this time with a different urgency, seeking responses that did not always come. Those who could move toward others, checking for injuries, offering assistance where possible. Some wounds were obvious, marked by torn fabric and blood-darkened earth. Others revealed themselves more slowly, as men attempted to stand, and found that their bodies did not respond as expected. There was no dramatic reaction to these discoveries, only a quiet acknowledgement shaped by necessity and repetition. The officers moved the line with a subdued focus, their earlier attempt to control replaced by a more measured assessment of what remained. They took stock of positions, counted those still able to fight, and noted the damage in a way that would later be translated into reports. Their authority had not disappeared, but it had changed. It no longer rested on the assumption of a functioning system behind them, but on their ability to respond to what was directly in front of them. Communication, when it finally reestablished itself in fragments, offered only partial explanations. Messages arrived late, distorted by distance and delay, indicating that corrections had been made, that errors in coordinates or transmission had been identified. The details varied, and none provided a complete account of how the situation had developed or why it had persisted for as long as it did. What became clear, however, was the extent to which the system they relied upon depended on precise alignment at every level. A single error, uncorrected, had cascaded into something far more destructive. Among the men, this understanding took on a different form. It was not framed in terms of communication protocols or artillery calibration. It was felt in the shift of expectation, in the quiet recognition that the structures meant to protect them were not infallible. The guns behind them, once a symbol of support, were now understood as part of a larger system that could fail without warning. As the hours passed and the line settled into a new, uneasy stillness, the psychological weight of the experience began to take shape. It was not expressed openly, nor did it need to be. It existed in the way movements became more deliberate, in the way each distant sound was evaluated with renewed caution. Even as the immediate threat subsided, the memory of its source remained close, altering the way each man interpreted the battlefield. The terrain itself seemed to reflect this shift. What had once been familiar, mapped and memorized, now appeared altered not just physically but in meaning. Each crater, each broken section of trench, carried with it the knowledge of how it had been formed. The ground was no longer just contested space between opposing forces. It was evidence of how easily the boundaries between those forces could blur. There was no formal moment of conclusion, no clear point at which the experience could be said to have ended. Instead, it settled into the ongoing reality of the war, becoming another layer of understanding that would shape decisions and reactions in the days to come. The line would be reinforced, positions adjusted, communication improved where possible. The system would continue, because it had to, but the belief in its consistency had been altered. Where there had once been an assumption of order, there was now a more cautious awareness, an understanding that control on the battlefield was not a fixed condition, but a fragile balance. The men carried this with them, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet recalibration of what they could expect from the forces around them. In the end, the bombardment left more than physical damage. It reshaped the way they understood their place within the larger structure of war. It replaced certainty with complexity, confidence with measured doubt, and in doing so, it revealed a truth that required no explanation, only experience to fully grasp. That even the systems designed to impose order could, under the right conditions, become indistinguishable from the chaos they were meant to control.